So we're just starting the PowerPoint in ninth grade on the Canterbury Tales for today. And anyway, somebody wrote this. I think it's interesting. When records weren't as precise as they are today, it just says that the world takes note when famous people die, but not sure when they were born. Just take that for what it is. We don't know exactly when he was born. His last name, well, his father was John Chaucer. His last name is a French word that means shoemaker. A lot of names, I don't know where Powell comes from, but a lot of names, Carpenter, people by that, Baker, people have the name Carpenter, Baker, Mason, clearly names derived from occupations. And that's where he was from a wealthy man, a wealthy family. That's not always the case with writers, but in his case it was. And his father was pretty well off, an owner, and he worked for the king. So you'll see that as a theme here. So he was a lifelong servant, that is Chaucer, and his name is Geoffrey. Okay, you haven't had these notes before, right?
Me too.
Have you gotten this far? All right, well, let's just quickly, lifelong servant of two kings. So you could say he was a bureaucrat, or you could call him a civil servant. So notice that he starts early, your age. He was already at work. He was already fighting in a war when he was 17, and imprisoned, captured and ransomed. And he was married at age 25. I was married at 24, so I don't think we're as radically different as people in other eras as sometimes we think we are. So he married. He serves for, it was this 13 years as a diplomat. And it's during his travels when he went to Italy that he might have met Petrarch. Petrarch is the founder or the creator of the sonnet. And there was a particular sonnet, the Petrarchan sonnet, Italian sonnet, named after him. Some people call Petrarch the ideal Renaissance man. So whenever you get to the Renaissance, which happens earlier in Italy than in England, you'll learn about him. He at least discovered the poetry of Dante. Dante, I wish I could remember when he died. I can't. But Dante is dead by this time, as Boccaccio is too. Boccaccio is also Italian. And Dante and Boccaccio and Petrarch probably, had the greatest influence on him, literarily. And then, the last 12 years of his life, he continues to work, not of his life, but the last 12 years of his career, he continues to work, have a regular job. What interests me, and I don't know that much about the time period as I would like, but what interests me is we have this modern idea that to be a writer, and I've mentioned this before sometimes, you have to quit your job and just write. That's no more true now than it was then. Chaucer had a regular job for all but 14 years of his life. And by the way, the last 14 years is when he worked on the Canterbury Tales, and his death interrupted that process. But he was a writer before that, so he would write on the side. So if you ever want to be a writer, and unless you do that for a living, there's some people that do. They work for publishing companies, or I don't know. There are a lot of ways you could be a writer, a journalist. But unless you do that kind of work, and you want to be a writer, you're probably going to, most of your life, have to do two jobs. One is earn a living, and secondly, write. So I've learned that if I wanted to have a writing thing, I would write it. I'd only in my spare time. And I told you about that story that I was writing I've enjoyed doing it. It's a hobby. It's not my, I mean, I don't make any money off of it. I'm sure I never will. But Chaucer was a great example of that. So he was a lifelong civil servant or diplomat. He dies, interestingly enough, on St. Crispin's Day, 1400. And St. Crispin's Day will mean something to you when you read Henry V. St. Crispin, I think there were two brothers. They were twins or just brothers, and they were martyred, and they're French, I believe. And the Catholic Church honored them on October 25th. Happens to be the day of this great battle that took place and is remembered in Henry V. So the speech we will learn from that. It's called the St. Crispin's Day speech. All right. So Chaucer the poet. One of the things I asked you at the beginning was, how important is he? And I gave you one answer. Well, here's the second answer. He's called the father of the English literary canon by some. That means that the canon is the list. It's the great accepted list of great books produced by English writers. And Chaucer stands at the beginning of that. You know, now Beowulf is written before Chaucer, but we don't know who wrote Beowulf. We don't have names, and Chaucer is sort of the one who began, although there were writers before him, I'm sure. He began that tradition of great literary work. And as we said, Chaucer was a busy man. He had a regular job, and so writing was his avocation. Do you know what an avocation is? You ever heard that word? Do you know what an occupation is? What's that? Is a job. So avocation is your hobby. So his job was civil servant. His occupation, his avocation was writer. That's a pretty good hobby. He didn't write for regular people. I think it'd be argued that Dante wrote for regular people. He wrote in the regular language, Italian. It's the first great work of literature, I don't know if in Italy at least, that wasn't written in Latin. He wrote it in Italian, the language of the people. Well, Chaucer didn't write specifically for common people. They probably couldn't read anyway. He wrote for courtly audience, and courtly means you could add royal. You could substitute the word royal for courtly. People that associated the peerage of England, the people that were the dukes and counts and nobles and related to the king. So all of his works are written for that kind of audience. And you get to read it because it's translated pretty much. And remember, he wrote in Middle English, which is what you're memorizing for Thursday. Wind that opera over the shower sotto. That's Middle English. It doesn't sound that much different from regular English. All right. So this is a list of the books he wrote, works that he wrote before the Canterbury Tales, which was his last book. First, he translated a book called Romance of the Rose, and I had a course in college about medieval literature. I didn't appreciate it at the time like I do now. I didn't know I'd be teaching medieval literature, but I read it, and it's called Romance of the Rose. It was an allegory about, well, I don't remember much, but love for one. The Book of the Duchess. You can write these down, and usually I ask one other, or maybe two other works by an author other than the one we read, just to let you know this wasn't a one-trick pony type thing. He was a writer that wrote a lot. He wrote something called The House of Fame, The Parliament of Fowls. I remember reading all of these. They're shorter than Canterbury Tales, but they're long poems. I remember reading, I think we read all of them in the Chaucer class. And I actually liked them. I don't know why. I wouldn't have thought. I didn't expect to like them. And then he wrote a book, Troilus and Cressida, which has been done by many people, including Shakespeare. And it's somebody said it's the most poignant love story in English narrative poetry. So it's a love story, I think, between a Trojan and a Trojan girl and a Greek soldier, I think. I can't remember. Shakespeare did it also, before Romeo and Juliet. And then he translated Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, which you've never heard before, but it was the most popular outside the Bible. And remember, people didn't have access to the Bible like we do. The church wouldn't let people read it. A lot of people didn't know Latin. I don't know what language it could have. There was the Latin version of the Bible. There was the Greek version, which was the original version. But the Consolation of Philosophy was the most popular book in the Middle Ages. And I had the privilege of reading it, or parts of it, and I have a copy somewhere. I don't know where. I know I still have it. And I remember liking it. I remember there are things about that I really like. That's the neat thing about college. You'd never do this on your own. You'd never read these books if I wasn't up here telling you about it. And then you discover this whole world that you didn't know about. And you dabble in it, and you realize, hey, I understand this. I like this. Or maybe, hopefully, sometimes you say that. And that's the need. If you ever want to be a teacher, you have to remember, you're not just teaching for the moment, like the quiz, the test coming up in a few weeks. That's not all I'm teaching for. I'm teaching for when you're 38 years old, or 48 years old, or at least 28 years old. That I'm telling you things that you have the rest of your life to explore. And there's a whole world out there that most people will never know. And that's what education is. It's to learn the great things, the greatest words and books that men produce. Even if they're not Christian, if they're noble, then if they don't contradict Christ, they're good. And sometimes even books that, like modern books, that aren't real happy and don't have much, you learn what life is like, even though they're not from a Christian point of view. You realize there are people that think this, yeah.
For the prologue for Thursday, we just memorize it, and are we gonna say it in class or something?
Yeah, we're gonna do something like it. It's not even a test or quiz. It's just a homework assignment. So yeah, we're gonna add to it. We're gonna do 8 the next time, then 12, and then 18. So yeah, we're gonna keep building on it. And I think once you learn the first 4 lines, you realize it's not gonna be as hard as maybe as you think. What are the Canterbury Tales? Let's start talking about it for a minute. He wrote it during that retirement period, the time he retired from active work. So between 1386 and 1400. And he did not finish it. We don't know how far he was. I mean, we don't know how much more he needed to do. It's hard to speculate on that. It was published by England's first printer, William Caxton, in the 1470s. So one of the first printers, or the first printer in England, printed his book, published his book. And 1470 he dies, so 70 years after he died, the Canterbury Tales are published. How about that? You write one of the greatest books ever written, and you never know that it's one of the greatest books ever written. You'll never know that because you died. He was influenced by French literature, especially allegorical love poetry. And I hope you understand what allegory. Do you know what allegory is? It's a story within a story. It's a story that has 2 meanings simultaneously. For next summer, this coming summer, you will read. We used to read the John Bunyan Pilgrim's Progress, and And that's one of the most famous allegories, because it's about a man going on a trip, but it's also about a Christian going to heaven. So at the same time. So that's what he liked. He liked reading books like that. He was influenced by books. Dante's Divine Comedy and the Decameron, which is by Boccaccio, also influenced Chaucer. Like the Canterbury Tales, the Decameron is a collection of tales. I've never read any of them. I've heard that they can be kind of bawdy, you know what I mean by that? R-rated at the very least, maybe worse. I've never read them, I can't tell you. But the Decameron is similar to the Canterbury Tales in that it's a story told by characters. So you have a group of 10 men and women who are trying to get away from the bubonic plague. And so they sit around telling stories. And that's sort of the framework you have here with the Canterbury Tales. They're not trying to avoid the plague, but they are on a trip, and they tell stories. One thing that also surprises me, I told you I was surprised in reading Chaucer how I enjoyed it. And I was expecting, Chaucer, I mean, who wants to read that? And I actually was surprised. My expectations were different. And I think you'll see that with the Canterbury Tales. You'll be surprised how interesting they can be, or how funny, or how just adventurous. They're full 24 of them. We're only going to read 3. I'm sorry. We should read more. But we really can't because we have other things we want to do. But you have the rest of your life to read more. I just want to go back and reread some of them that I haven't read in a long time. I say that every year, and we move on. All right. Canterbury Tales is a collection of tales bound together by framework. So it's a story within a story. And I mentioned this several times. The framework is a trip to Canterbury Cathedral, the site of Thomas Becket's death and burial. And the pilgrims simply tell stories to entertain themselves on the way. I don't know if what you have in your car when you were a kid and you went on a long trip, I don't know what's available, but what I had in my car was the back seat of my mom and dad. There was nothing else in the car. Even the radio couldn't pick up much. And so we'd go from Atlanta to Myrtle Beach. It'd take about 6 hours. And the only thing that entertained me was the window and my imagination. If my sisters were with me, we would maybe do count cows or find, you know, those kind of games, those automobile games. You know, you have that. You don't have video, you don't have radio, you don't have audio. You have fresh air because there's no air conditioning. So this is so typical of people. You got this long, boring trip. How are you going to entertain yourselves? You tell stories. And that's what they do here. distance between London and Canterbury is 55 miles, and it would have taken them 4 days to make it, an average group of pilgrims. And so his plan appeared to be that 30 pilgrims would tell 4 stories each. So that's where we get the 120, because 30 pilgrims telling 2 stories would be 60. So they would get there telling 2 stories, and they would come back telling 2 stories, more stories. So it's possible that the Canterburys were designed to have 120 stories in it. There's no way to know. He only wrote 24, because he died. And so we just have to speculate about what Canterbury Tales would have become had he lived. He was born in 1340, died in 1400, so he was 60 years old. That's not bad. Shakespeare, I think, was 54 or 56. The lifespan in the Middle Ages wasn't what it is today. As I said, only 24 out of the possible 120 that he had planned, only wrote 24. And so it wasn't published. It took, what did we say, it took 70 years for it to eventually be published. So the tales were organized by later people, later editors, into 10 groups. ABC. So if you see this, I was always confused as I looked in the contents of the book. I was always confused by that. Like, here it is, Group A, Group B. So there are 10 groups, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, I only got 9. He says there are 10. But people had to figure out what he had in mind. And so it is written in Middle English. We know that. Each pilgrim tells a story that's appropriate for who he is. Like the knight tells an adventure story. The miller tells a kind of bawdy story about this love relationship. It's kind of R-rated. The nun's priest tells a story with a moral. They all have morals. But each person, the friar tells a story about a terrible sumner, and the sumner tells a story about a terrible friar. So they tell stories appropriate for who they are. And Chaucer borrowed the tales from other sources. That was acceptable. He didn't necessarily give credit. What would we call that today? You borrow somebody else's idea and you claim it's your own. What do we call that? Right. And so that's because we have something called copyright laws, and people own their ideas and they own their words, and you just can't use them and claim that you wrote them. That would be stealing. And personally, I don't understand the problem with documenting. Because to me, documentation adds to the credibility of what you have to say. You know, like, I think, to me, I felt proud saying it. So-and-so said this. Here are his exact words. You can find it in this book. That didn't bother me. It was a lot of trouble, but to me, it added credibility to my argument. I'm nobody. But this guy, he knows what he's talking about. And look what he said about it. So, I don't know why students would ever plagiarize. I know they do because it's quicker, it's easier. But it's also not as satisfying. I find a lot of satisfaction when I find what other people say and I use it to prove my argument. There was no idea about plagiarism. Shakespeare, I read it myself with my own eyes, took complete passages from Plutarch and gave it to Brutus and Cassius when those famous speeches in when Julius Caesar. He didn't give anybody credit, didn't change the words. He lifted exact words, passages even, and used them. And does that make you think less of Shakespeare? It was certainly not considered a bad thing to do then. And Shakespeare created plenty of his own stuff, and he always took other people's works and he made it his own. And that's kind of what he does. He takes other stories and he puts them in a different context. And so, that's just something to note, that the idea of plagiarism didn't really exist. The other thing about the Shakespeare, about the Canterbury Tales, is how varied they are. There's so many different kinds of stories, and there are two slides on this, and I want you to write these down and remember them. So not all the stories are not all the same. Some of the stories are romantic, and the word romance doesn't just deal with love. We've completely lost the idea. Romance can be heroic, adventurous, and mysterious. Just because it's romantic doesn't mean that it's about love. It might be, but romance is a way of looking at life. A fableau is a short comic coarse tale. That's the Miller's tale. He tells kind of a coarse story. People tell, we used to call them dirty jokes or something like that. That's what that is. And so we don't typically teach that in class. You can read it if you want to, it's in there. A beast epic, we are going to read a beast epic. The Nun's Priest Tale is a beast epic. And a beast epic is when you have animals that talk. Animal Farm is a modern example. What is the fables, Aesop? Those are about animals that talk. And so there's one of those here. There's a legend. I don't know which one that is. And there's a saint's life. These are typical stories that people would have read in those days. And so he uses examples of those in his book. So that's why no two stories are the same. No two stories are the same length. And that's just, to me, adds to the richness of it, because there's so much there to different things to enjoy. There's another slide. So let me go to that. An exemplum. It's a kind of a parable type story. A story that would be used by pastors to illustrate a point. There's a sermon here. There's a tragedy here, and that was one of the questions on the test. What a tragedy was. A popular story during the Middle Ages is a miracle involving Mary, the Virgin Mary. And there's one of those. And here's a quote to me that Dryden was a contemporary of Shakespeare. And he says, "'Tis sufficient to say, according to the proverb, that here is God's plenty." There's such a variety and richness to these. And almost all end with some proverb or other wisdom. Part of the contest that was created, because it was a contest, they were actually going to have a contest. Who told the best story? And out of that, one of the criteria was it had to have a moral. So it had to have some lesson at the end. And it says almost all, and I couldn't tell you which ones did not have one. And every time I do this, I'm inspired to read them again. And I rarely ever get there. I'd like to be able to do that this year. At least a couple that I'd like to go back and reread. I don't think there's much more. We might be able to finish. Just got a few minutes. Remember, for tomorrow, the quiz. And you should be reading. Anybody having trouble with Peace Child? It's only 60 pages, and you got the book last Wednesday. So still got a couple more nights to read. And we read practically the first chapter, at least a lot of it. And you have questions, so just make sure that you've done that. So let me see what else I have to show you. All right, well, this may be the last one, but these are great quotations about the prologue, which we're going to start tomorrow after the quiz. We're going to start reading the prologue, the one you're going to memorize. And the prologue is really pretty long. We're only memorizing the first 18 lines. So there's a lot more to the prologue than what you're memorizing. If you don't get this all in today, I'll put it up tomorrow. But it is the concise portrait of an entire nation, high and low, old and young, male, female, lay and clerical, learned and ignorant, rogue and righteous. So what you get when you read the prologue is a picture of medieval England and all the different kinds of people that lived there. That's why it's so brilliant that he was able to capture in just 20 pages, we're talking about the prologue, what England was like, the kinds of people that lived there. The pilgrims are presented with stunning clarity, touched with nuance, very normal without extreme. So none of the characters are like extreme examples. You know, you see in life extreme examples of one type of person or another. These aren't like that. These are very believable, ordinary people that represent different kinds of people. And finally, they are the perennial progeny of men and women. Progeny or offspring. So you will recognize in the prologue that we start tomorrow, you will recognize people like that you know. That's why this is a classical work of art, because here it is, 600 years later, people are still reading it and find value in it. It still teaches us about human beings. Honestly, if you're just watching TV or watching movies, you're not getting an honest picture of what life is like. And that's why we read, because you get an honest, true picture of what people are like and what ideas are important. So tonight, good luck as you, and I'll put this up again tomorrow if you don't get it all. These are, I think, good quotations to end with. So whenever you finish, you can pack up